This is FDR and the New Deal Objective 1 about the policy goals of the first New Deal, which took place during the Great Depression of the 1930s. The number one thing to remember about the Great Depression is that it's not just an economic depression, it's also a psychological one. People during this time had been raised and accustomed to standing on their own 2 feet. They had grown up with the idea that you made something out of yourself, and when something went wrong, you just picked yourself up by your bootstraps and you moved on. But now they were in need of assistance, and they really had no government programs to help them out. And that was probably the hardest thing for people who lived during this time period. Again, they'd been raised on the idea that you took care of yourself, you made something of yourself, you didn't need any government to help you out. And when they found themselves suddenly unable to do things for themselves, they found that they needed the assistance, and that made them view themselves as failures. The lady in the image here is Dorothea Lange. She was the most famous photographer who went around the country capturing the emotional images of the Great Depression. It's in her photographs that you can see the pain on the people's faces, and she spent most of her time in California. Works like this one, called White Angel Breadline in San Francisco, symbolized what people were going through during the Great Depression emotionally. And this one, probably her most famous work, Migrant Mother, which is in the Smithsonian today. Dorothea Lange was traveling through California and paid this woman to take her photograph, and found out that the woman on the morning of this photo had killed a robin for her kids to eat because she had tried to steal some beans from a field and the farmer was shooting at them and driving them off. With really nothing to feed her kids, she decided to kill a robin with a rock, and that's what her kids ate that morning. Dorothea Lange captured these images of people's pain and the emotional scars that they were going through all throughout the 1930s and became famous for it. During these desperate times, people were doing desperate things. 25% of the nation is unemployed at this point. That's 1 out of every 4 people. Today, if the unemployment rate gets up around 8 or 9%, people have just fits about the whole thing. But back then, it was 25% of the country was unemployed. The image of the great American hobo looking for work now becomes common. Hobos were people who sold everything off except just 1 pair of clothes, really, and the image of the hobo is often seen with the stick and the bag and the derby hat or a similar style hat. A lot of hobos were former bankers, lawyers, doctors, people who lost everything on the stock market. The hobo was typically somebody who rode the rails from town to town, either in the boxcar like this or on top of the tracks. A lot of times, the price was free, of course, because they were waiting for the train to start pulling out, and when it did, they would jump on board. Hobos, as they were going from town to town, when the train started to slow down, would jump off and go into town looking for work. And then they'd hide in the bushes and wait for the train to roll out so they could board. The main reason is because if you were caught on the train without a ticket, in those days, there were so many hobos that guards were authorized to shoot on sight if they caught you. So a lot of times you were hiding out in the boxcar or on the train tops, and frankly, hobo poetry became something that was a big part of American culture during the 1930s. People who were just writing about going from place to place looking for work and all the tragedy that went along with that. Hobos even had their own sign language, as you can see on the slide here. It wasn't a sign language that was done with hands, but with chalk marks that were left on posts, indicating that you could go to jail if you ended up at this person's house. It was basically a set of signs that one hobo would leave for another. If you were a hobo approaching a house, these signs, these chalk marks that were left behind by people who had tried to visit previously, could give you a really good idea of what to expect if you asked the person inside for help. But the emotional scars of the Great Depression were more than just the disappointment and anxiety as you were looking for a job. It was also the anxiety about keeping your money in a bank. Remember, in the 1920s, people had trusted their money in banks, and banks had loaned out way too much. People didn't trust them as much anymore and decided to hide their money at home instead of putting them in banks. Also, as you can imagine, crime rates are going up during this time. People that used to be middle class are now being reduced to robbing people of food or robbing people of whatever they could, mugging people on the streets. And as you can imagine, divorces and suicides are going up during this time too. Mothers completely unable to take care of their kids now, which is the fundamental thing that a mother does. Imagine being a mom who can't feed her own child. Imagine being a father who can't provide for his family. These are the fundamental things before you do anything else in your life that you're supposed to do as a mother and a father. And people are failing at that now. And that's where the psychological damage really starts to come in. Again, a lot of times this led to suicides. And the guy that everybody was blaming for this, rightly or wrongly, was Herbert Hoover. And by the time we get to the election of 1932, it really didn't matter who it was running for the Republican Party. They weren't going to have a chance because the Republican Party was associated with Herbert Hoover. And so the Republicans nominated him again. The Democrats, meanwhile, nominate New York Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was actually the fifth cousin of Theodore Roosevelt and was also Harvard educated, just like Theodore Roosevelt had been. Was from a wealthy family, just like Theodore Roosevelt had been, and grew up in a big house. This is Franklin D. Roosevelt's house from when he was a kid. Grew up in a big house, just like Theodore Roosevelt had been. There are other similarities between the two as well. Both men had been Secretary of the Navy. Here's Franklin Roosevelt serving that role, just like his cousin Theodore. But there were differences between the two as well. Theodore Roosevelt, remember, was very abrasive when he dealt with people. And he was also very much a bully. Teddy Roosevelt, basically used those two tactics to a high degree when he was president. Franklin was quite a bit different, though, in this regard. Franklin himself was very charming and very witty. Franklin Roosevelt, while being able to get along with people well, was also known for having a very commanding presence and a great speaking voice. And one of the things that people rarely remember about Franklin Roosevelt in this day and age is that in 1921, he was handicapped by polio. Being in a wheelchair was part of what helped him learn humility and compassion and, frankly, determination and will. When Franklin had been governor of New York, he had engaged in huge spending programs to help those in poverty. And as a result, even though he grew up wealthy, other wealthy people often referred to him as the traitor to his class. By the time he was up for president, he was announcing a new deal for the American people that was designed to help out the poor once again, even if it meant taxing the rich to make that happen, which, as you can imagine, just increased the traitor to his class myth or traitor to his class view that was around him. The thing was, with the New Deal, his speeches were often very vague and contradictory, so nobody was really sure what it was or what to make of him. And that's where his wife Eleanor really comes into play. His wife Eleanor may have been the greatest first lady in history, primarily because while he was addressing the nation as a whole and dealing with the macroeconomic aspects of taking care of the entire country, it was Eleanor who was traveling the nation on behalf of him and his programs to aid the poor. The biggest thing that was appealing about Franklin Roosevelt is that he was willing to do something. Hoover had basically given up. He was essentially going to be a lame duck president if he didn't get elected, and he probably wasn't going to do anything if he did. FDR, on the other hand, was optimistic, confident, and basically willing to try anything. FDR's speeches had been written by a group called the Brain Trust, which was a group of reform-minded young college professors that FDR trusted implicitly. And he relied on them and their optimism and their wit and their knowledge to get a message across to the people that offered some kind of hope. His campaign slogan and his song was "Happy Days Are Here Again," and that very much seemed to fit the mood that he was trying to project. And eventually, the campaign was becoming a lot more about being anti-Hoover as much as it was about being pro-FDR. Well, you can imagine what happened. This slide here is the election of 1928 when Herbert Hoover had gotten elected. You can see how many states are in the red here. Hoover in 1928, when the economy was doing well, had been elected by a huge margin. But this is what the map looks like in 1932. Remember, the red states indicate the Republicans, and as you saw in 1928, it was a huge victory for Herbert Hoover back then. But 4 years later, all those red states had turned blue. Herbert Hoover only took Pennsylvania, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and Connecticut in one of the biggest landslide victories for anybody in the history of presidential politics. But remember, Hoover was still in office until March of the following year, as had been presidential custom in the Constitution. So Hoover continued on as what became known as a lame duck president until March 4th of 1933. So FDR gets elected in November of 1932 and is chomping at the bit to get started. But Hoover gets to stay there, and frankly, he had some real psychological problems with that, serious depression. He played a lot of tetherball during his final days as president, really doing nothing to try to solve the economic problem that had resulted. As a result, because of the whole lame duck presidency of Herbert Hoover, the 20th Amendment was eventually passed. Now, this is the reason that presidents now take over in January instead of March, and it's why the amendment is referred to as the lame duck amendment, because of the lame duck president, Herbert Hoover. Also, another big shift made the election of 1932 significant. African Americans, who had been traditionally grateful to the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln, now shifted allegiances to the Democrats. They had often been the quote-unquote last hired and first fired, and felt Franklin Roosevelt would solve their problems. This was a monumental shift because African Americans, like I said, from 1860 to 1932, had always voted Republican, and now they were voting Democratic. But probably the most famous aspect of the inauguration speech that took place at that time was the idea of the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. I'm sure you've heard the phrase before, and this is where it came about in the inaugural speech of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932. Okay, that's it for FDR and the New Deal, Objective 1, Part 1. Thanks for listening.